We're good to go. Well, very good. Well, welcome to this, our second webinar in November, sponsored and in conjunction with Hordes Dairyman. We are very pleased to have many of you online. We see some very familiar faces. We see some new faces as well. And so we're excited to want to thank Pfizer Animal Health. Dairy Wellness Makes a Difference is their theme to sponsoring this webinar here. And we have one of their own presenters here today also. I'm Mike Hutchins. I tend to host this, and I tend to keep everything on schedule, on time, bring questions. As some of you are new to the system, if you have a question, go ahead and type them in. We will not answer them until Dr. Lee is done with his presentation, because we want to keep everything on schedule. We are targeting about a 45 to 48 minute webinar for you here today. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. John Lee. He is the managing veterinarian with Pfizer Animal Health Dairy Team today, and he lives in Bakersfield, California. Dr. Lee received his BS and D.V.M. degrees from Oregon State University. That was, I'm sure, John, that's not the Ducks. Maybe we
That's the Beavers.
The Beavers. You're playing the Ducks, I think, Saturday, are you not?
We are.
And that could be kind of I think they're going to be ugly after watching them on last Saturday night. Anyway, Dr. Lee spent 20 years in practice in Central California, and his expertise includes a lot of international dairy consulting, clinical investigations, research, teaching in support of dairy production, and he is a marathon runner. And John, you don't realize this, but I've also been in 3 marathons, but I do not do marathons. I do 5Ks, so quite a bit sure. But he's been in 28 marathons and 16 half marathons. So Dr. Lee, we're pleased to turn the program over to you, and welcome.
Well, thank you. Thanks. I appreciate the opportunity to speak on this topic, and this is a topic that's become near and dear to my heart. It is also a topic that is pretty important right now when we look at producers who are concerned about cost and are looking at ways to lower cost, because the reality is that if we improve heifer reproduction, we can lower the cost of raising heifers. So I think the key take-home message from my presentation is that the lower age at first calving is the single most important benchmark for achieving the highest economic return in a replacement heifer program. And if you look at the data, and this is through an analysis that was done several years ago of millions of lactating records. Every month beyond 22 months cost about $100 per animal. And right now, with current feed cost and pricing, it's probably way more than $100 per month per heifer. But it's primarily due to lost milk production opportunity derived from animals which calve early, and a lower number of days of productive life. And when you look at these heifers that calve at 22 months, what they found is that we can control when a heifer calves, but we don't have a lot of control over when the average heifer leaves the herd. And so irregardless of whether a heifer calves at, the average heifer calves at 22 months or the average heifer calves at 24 months, they still leave, the average heifer still leaves the herd at about the same amount, at the same age. And so what that translates into is that if we calve them early, we have more days of productive life, and we capture more milk out of those heifers. So here's the focus of heifer reproduction. We want to improve the rate of pregnancy production. We also want to decrease the age of calving, but not just the age. We need to decrease the variation in age of calving. And we need to decrease the number of non-pregnant culls that come out at the tail end of our reproductive program in heifers. And ultimately, we want to decrease expenses and increase profit on a dairy. So let me illustrate this a little bit by looking at a heifer life cycle. And we've got these heifers that are born, and then they spend about 10% of their heifer raising time in the calf pen. And if we're going to have these so ultimately we want, these are of course for Holstein heifers, we want these heifers to calve at about 185 pounds. And then the next step then is our weaning to breeding. And what we find is that this calf pen raising has far-reaching impacts all the way through the rest of that heifer's lifetime. And if we don't do a good job in the calf pen, we actually give up thousands of pounds of milk out of that heifer when she reaches the over her lifetime. And also, if we don't do a good job in these first 2 periods, we delay the age at which that heifer reaches the voluntary waiting period. And if you notice, I've got that weight not in WAIT, but in weight as in pounds. And it's really the weight of that heifer that determines when she starts cycling and when she's eligible to go into the breeding program. And that is all controlled by what happens in those first 2 periods. Then the next thing that we have control over is how long does it take, once we enter those heifers into the breeding period, how long does it take us to get first service into those heifers and then get them pregnant? And then the key thing here is that when we get them pregnant, we actually lock in their age at first calving. So because gestation is fixed, the act of getting that heifer pregnant determines what age she's going to calve. And then we'd like to, for these Holstein heifers, we'd like them to calve at 1,350 to 1,400 pounds. And if we don't do a good job in growing these heifers, they'll never reach that weight when they calve, or we're going to have to calve them at an older age. We also can't just lower our voluntary waiting period on these heifers. We have to do a better job of growing them if we're going to breed them sooner. So remember, the total cost of growing heifers ends at calving, and costs are not locked in until heifers become pregnant.
Well, I think we're ready to vote. So at this point, John's got a question here for you and said, "What is your current cost per day to feed close-up heifers?" Now watch that, close-up heifers. So these are heifers that are heavy pregnant, and so let's go ahead and vote. The polls are now open at this point, and we should be voting at this point. So we are getting some votes in here. We have about, let's see, can I even see the number of votes? Come on, you Democrats, you only can vote once, and you Republicans don't dilly-dally at this point. So but we got, Jim says we got 55 votes in already, is that right? Holy cow, that's amazing. You folks are really on the stick at this point. Well, we're going to share this with you now, so we're going to close the polls in 2 seconds here. Jim is counting it down, and we will show the answers. So, Dr. Lee, what do you think of the answers here? Any thoughts?
Well, I think that the poll is about where I thought costs were. I think the most important thing that this points out is that in the past, a lot of producers were spending $2, $2.50 a day to feed a close-up heifer, and now those costs have gone up significantly. So it's not uncommon to see $3 or more per day to feed a close-up heifer. I think it's important that producers know that, and I'll show you why. So let's look at a simple cost-raising spreadsheet that Dr. Steve Smalley and I put together. And there were a few ahas as we put this together. One is that if we're going to wean our heifers at 70 days, and this is fairly typical in Holstein herds, we're going to start breeding them at about 13 months or 395 days of age. And then we're going to take, on average, 42 days to get them pregnant. Those heifers are going to calve in at 23.5 months of age. That is not the goal of getting down in that 22 to 23 months, but this is what's typically done on most Holstein operations. The other aha that we had from this is that we really need to push for lean growth during this weaning to breeding age. This is an extremely efficient period to grow these heifers, and it's very inexpensive to put gain on here. Now, we still have to do a good job prior to weaning, but that period of weaning to breeding, we have an opportunity to achieve gain at a very low cost. I see way too many producers who are concentrating on cost per day to feed a heifer rather than cost per pound of gain. The other aha is that if a heifer calves in at 700 days of age versus another heifer that calves in at 701 days of age, that heifer at 701 days of age has more days on feed to get her into the barn, and those extra days are actually spent as a big heifer consuming more feed. And at the time we did this spreadsheet, it was $2.50 on average to feed a close-up heifer. Now that's more. Now it's more than that. But the aha was that every day we delay conception on a heifer, it adds to her days open, and those days open are really represented by the cost of feeding in the close-up pen. The other aha was that if prostaglandin costs $2 a dose, and if we used it and it only saved 1 day, it is still marginally profitable. And any extra days saved because we got that heifer to come in earlier from that prostaglandin injection is pure profit. Now, the other aha from this is that if a heifer comes in to heat 1 day earlier and she doesn't get bred or she doesn't conceive, we still capture that additional day's savings as long as she becomes pregnant and joins the herd. So think about that. If she comes into heat 1 day earlier this heat, she's also going to come into heat 1 day earlier the next heat. And so those days that we save by giving prostaglandin, we maintain those as long as those heifers become pregnant and join the herd. The take-home message is that not getting heifers bred and pregnant is expensive, and if we improve reproduction, we can lower feed cost.
Well, we have another poll question, so get ready to vote here. And you folks have been really Johnny on the spot at this point. What measure do you use to monitor heifer reproductive performance? Select only one. Age at first calving, average conception rate, number of pregnancies at preg check, the preg rate, or do not monitor at all. So which one of these do you actually use as your monitor? And I know which one I'd vote for. I'm not sure if I'll be right or not. We're up to about 41%, and the poll's been open 32 seconds, so let's get voting here. We're doing pretty good. Wow, we got a bunch of voters here today, I tell you. Just one election cycle, and everybody's voting pretty aggressively. We got 2/3 of the vote in 40 seconds, and now we're kind of stalled out. So, Jim, let's go ahead and close the poll, and we'll turn it back to Dr. John and for his interpretation.
So this is pretty much what I see. Primarily producers, in this case, 61% monitor age at first calving, 9% age or average conception rate, and 9% number pregnant at preg check. And we'll talk about that a little bit, but there are some disadvantages of using those metrics. So let's look at that here. And really the question is what is the current, and that's the defining word here, is what is the current reproductive performance in your herd? That's what every herd manager should know. Is it as good as you think it is? And then the question that I have is, how do you know what it is currently? What measures of heifer reproductive performance are going to drive results? And if we aren't using current metrics, then we can't really drive what's currently going on the dairy. Better decisions are made with current measures of reproductive performance. So I think that the poll really illustrates that these are very commonly used metrics in the dairy industry. There are some issues with these metrics. Average age at first calving has a lot of lag built into it. It is telling us actually how we did with our reproductive performance in our heifers 9 months ago, not what's currently happening. Average age at conception is telling us how we've done on average through the year, but it really doesn't measure current reproductive performance. and number of heifers pregnant at preg check is telling us that that is so influenced by how many heifers we have available to get pregnant, and it doesn't necessarily mean how quickly we're converting the eligible heifers to pregnant. So I'd really recommend that you don't use these metrics because they don't reflect current performance. So here's another conception rate logic that I have, and this is used by producers who don't think that they need to improve their heifer reproductive performance. And I commonly hear this: 90% of my heifers are pregnant within 3 services. Why do I need to make any changes? Well, if you measure it by conception rate, and if a herd is able to achieve over 60% conception rate for the first 3 services in their heifers, they do indeed get to over 90% of their heifers pregnant within 3 services. But my question here is, what's missing from this? And there's a very key thing missing here, and that is time. This does not actually answer the question, how rapidly are open heifers being converted to pregnant heifers? Conception rate has no time factor included. Because the problem is that 100% of open heifers are not inseminated every 21 days. We miss lots of heifers. So a better metric is to use pregnancy rate. Pregnancy rate is used because it adds the time factor. So let's look at this. If we measure this same herd rather than on first 3 services, but on pregnancy rate, we're actually looking at 21-day cycles. And if we look at these first 3 21-day cycles, and in a heifer reproduction, or a heifer herd that's able to achieve over 30% pregnancy rates, they actually, at the end of 3 cycles, only have 73% of their heifers pregnant. And if you take that out even to 5 cycles, or 105 days, they still don't have 90% of their heifers pregnant. But then think about this. If in that first cycle 0% of the heifers get moved into the AI pen, then 0% are inseminated. If 0% are inseminated, then 0% are pregnant in that first cycle. And then if we go to the second cycle, and we've got 60% of the heifers being inseminated, which is fairly typical, then we still have 40% of those heifers that aren't even inseminated, and so on and so on. And if we go out even to 4 cycles, we still have 10% of those heifers that are not even inseminated, of which they have 0% chance of being pregnant. So here's some much better metrics to use in monitoring reproductive performance in heifers. One is, we want to look at voluntary wait period compliance. And the question we need to answer is, are heifers being moved into the AI pen often enough and according to plan? Are they actually getting where the AI technicians can get them inseminated? And then also we need to look at distribution of first breedings. How long after the voluntary waiting period is it taking to get first insemination into heifers? And then we want to definitely look at pregnancy rate. This is the gold standard by which reproductive performance is measured. It answers the question, how efficiently are eligible heifers becoming pregnant? And then we want to look at the next two, at the 2 major components that drive pregnancy rate. One is insemination risk. How efficiently are eligible heifers being inseminated every 21 days? And then conception risk. And we really want to know, has there been a recent change in conception risk on heifers? So for very large herds, you can look at conception risk by week. For very small herds, you probably have to look at conception risk by month. But here's the other aha on this, is that these are the same key metrics we used to drive reproductive performance in cows. So use exactly the best metrics that we use for cows for heifers. So why should we care about this? After all, heifers are really easy to get pregnant. Why should we make any effort? Well, the reason is that there's money to be made. We know that if we have a process that we measure and we monitor and then we act on it, we can improve it. And there's a big difference between active management versus passive management. If we want something to perform optimally, we have to actively manage it. So here's a look at a graph of age at conception in days for a herd that is passively managing their reproductive program. So they're starting to get heifers pregnant at around 400 days. And then we go out here and we've got out to 570 days that they're still getting heifers pregnant. Well, that's a pretty big span on conception. The other thing to notice is that this is a bell-shaped curve. Now, bell-shaped curves are common in biological systems. Why are they common? Well, bell-shaped curves actually come from the variability in the process. The more variability we have, the more we go to a bell-shaped curve and the wider that curve is. So here's another herd that has active management of the reproductive process in their heifers, and you'll notice that it's not a bell-shaped curve. Rather, it's a left skewed curve. They get most of their heifers pregnant right up front, and then they keep working on those heifers. So if you look at the active process, they really narrow that window down in how long it takes heifers to get pregnant.
Well, we have another interesting poll question that John will address here. Do heifers reproductively outperform lactating cows? So we should be able to vote pretty fast. There's only 4 choices here. Yes, on all dairies. Heifers are reproductively outperforming cows. Yes, on most dairies. No, they should, but usually do not. And then finally, I don't know. Aren't going to know. So we're off and running. We've got pretty close to about 40% of the vote in, so that's great. You folks are doing a good job today. It must be the weather. That's all I can figure out. Beautiful weather in Champaign, actually. And we're going to get to our 66% here awfully fast here at this point, Jim, the way it's working out at this point. Some of us are dilly-dallying here, so I think we are ready to close the poll at 64%. And John, let's see what your interpretation is.
Well, I think that the answer is that, most of you think that yes, on most dairies they do outperform them, and intuitively it really should. Heifers show heats better, they're more fertile, they have higher conception rates, it's easier to find the heats, all of those things that go into a successful reproductive program. And in reality, I think you're going to be a little surprised at the results when we looked at the data. So the question that I had is, what sort of heifer pregnancy rates are large herds achieving? And to do this, before we start, the first thing I want to do is define pregnancy rate. Remember that pregnancy rate is the speed at which, it measures the speed at which heifers are being converted from open heifers to pregnant heifers. It is, the formula for that is the number becoming pregnant divided by the number eligible to become pregnant in the same time period. So heifers don't even have to be in the AI pen. They don't even have to be inseminated to be, as long as they meet our eligibility requirements, they are in the calculation. And this is usually measured as a 21-day pregnancy rate. It is not the same at conception rate. The only animals in a conception rate calculation are the ones that are actually inseminated. So what sort of heifer pregnancy rates are possible in heifers? And you think about this, is it 20% like we typically shoot for in cows? Is it 30% or is it 40%? Well, the thing you need to remember is what are the two major components or drivers of pregnancy rate? Well, those two major components or drivers are insemination risk and conception risk. And if you multiply those two, that is not the correct formula for calculating pregnancy rate, but if you multiply conception risk times insemination risk or heat detection rate, it is approximately equal to pregnancy rate. So if we think about that, those are the two main drivers, we should be able to estimate what kind of pregnancy rates are possible in heifers. So I think we would all agree that achieving 40% conception risk in heifers is very doable, and we ought to be able to find half of them in heat every 21 days and to be able to achieve without any trouble a 20% pregnancy rate. But we probably ought to be able to achieve a 55% conception risk and a 55% heat detection rate, or a 30% preg rate. And herds that are really firing on all cylinders ought to be able to achieve a 62% conception rate and a 65% heat detection rate on their heifers, which would be a 40% pregnancy rate. And so what I did is I took 47 herds. These are large southwestern Holstein herds, large being defined as milking over 2,000 cows, who had good reproductive records on their heifers. And I looked at what kind of pregnancy rates they were achieving. And I think most of you are going to be shocked at what I found. Now, the other thing that I've found since is that this is fairly typical across the United States, and actually fairly typical in other countries that I've looked at data from. And that is that when we look at when we take these 47 herds and we calculate their pregnancy rate based on their AI voluntary waiting period, so what age do they start breeding heifers, and we then rank them 1 through 47 from highest pregnancy rate to lowest pregnancy rate, we see that the highest herds are achieving in the mid-30s to low 40s, and the poorest herds are down in single-digit pregnancy rates. The median's only 19%. This is a big shocker for most people, and it was a shocker for me. The other thing that I found is that for many of these herds, the heifer pregnancy rates were actually lower than the cow herd. And we know that heifers are more fertile, so they ought to outperform the cows, but they were not in many of these herds. So what's the impact of improving pregnancy rate? Why should we care about that as it relates to distribution of age at first calving? And if we take a 20% pregnancy rate herd and compare it to a 33% pregnancy rate herd, both of these herds have the exact same voluntary waiting period. They start breeding their heifers at a typical 13 months of age. What we find is that the herd that it's a 20% pregnancy rate, if they're able to achieve 20% pregnancy rate in the first 10 cycles, they only get 49% of their heifers pregnant by 24 months of age, or they only are able to calve 49% of their heifers before 24 months of age. If that same herd, if they started with the exact same voluntary waiting period, if they improve their pregnancy rate to 33%, what we find is that they actually will calve 70% of their heifers before 24 months of age. This is not lowering they did not lower the voluntary waiting period. They just did a better job of getting semen into heifers and getting heifers pregnant. They were able to lower the age at first calving and improve the distribution of age at first calving. What we see is that if we look at this 33% pregnancy rate herd and we look at average days to conception, they have 49 average days to conception. That 20% pregnancy rate herd has 69 average days to conception. That means that their heifers on average are going to calve, the 33% pregnancy rate herd is going to calve their heifers on average 20 days earlier. If their feed cost to feed springers is $2.50 a day, they're going to be able to lower their heifer raising feed cost by $50. Now, the question I have for producers is, if somebody said that they would sell you the exact same heifers for $50 a head cheaper, would that be a good deal? And I think everybody would say, yeah, it is. And so by making some very simple modifications to the breeding program, we can lower the total feed costs for heifers by $50. The other thing that's the aha here is that at the end of 10 cycles, so in order to not have heifers calving over 29 months of age, we cut it off. The herd that has a 33% preg rate has 9% fewer open heifers that are either culled after 10 cycles or are going to go ahead and calve as fat springers. The other aha here is if you look at that blue arrow and you look at that box above there in average days to pregnancy, that is that in order to achieve an average age of calving below 24 months, if you start at 13 months, in order to start breeding heifers at 13 months, to get them to, on average, to calve under 24 months, you have to have a 33% pregnancy rate, because a 33% pregnancy rate it leads to an average days to conception of 49 days. So then the next question I have is, what are these high-performing herds doing better than the low-performing herds? And if I ask the question, what are the two major components of pregnancy rate? Hopefully all of you are going to say, well, it's conception risk and insemination risk, or our conception rate and our heat detection rate. Okay, those are the two big drivers. And so I looked at these herds and kept them ranked from highest preg rate to low preg rate. The first thing I did is I looked at their conception risk. And if you'll notice, there's very little difference between conception risk in the high-performing herds versus the low-performing herds. And in fact, the median conception risk for all of these herds is a little over 50%. That's very in line with the national data. So the big driver, the big thing producers ought to be, the big thing to strive for is not to improve conception risk. You don't improve preg rates for most herds by really striving to improve their conception risk. But if you look at the insemination risk across these herds, there's a high correlation between insemination risk and pregnancy rate. And it's kind of shocking to see how low the insemination risk or heat detection rate is for some of these herds. And so the question you have to have is, and if you'll see, there's a very high correlation between those two. I think it's important to stop here and say, hey, how can herds have that low of insemination risk? Is it that AI technicians are that bad? Or is something happening that management's doing that's keeping these heifers from achieving high insemination risk? But the message here is that insemination efficiency is the key to improving heifer pregnancy rates for most herds. And it is affected by both the time from the voluntary waiting period. Remember, this is an age voluntary waiting period to the first insemination, and time between subsequent inseminations after heifers get that first insemination if they don't conceive to the first service. So a reminder for monitoring heifer reproduction is we want to determine the voluntary waiting period compliance. Are heifers being moved to the AI pen often enough? And that's the big driver for most of these herds. We need to determine the distribution of first breedings. How long after the voluntary waiting period is it taking to get first breeding into heifers? Pregnancy rate, and then insemination risk. Insemination risk is really two things. We want to monitor management. How are we doing at growing heifers and getting heifers into the AI pen? And then we also want to monitor AI technicians. And once heifers get into the AI pen, how are they doing at getting heifers inseminated? I find almost no herds where the problem is the AI technician. It's actually the first part of that. And then we want to, of course, monitor conception risk. Is our conception risk holding up to where we need it to be?
Well, we have another chance to vote here, gang. So the question that John has posed is, what is the biggest driver of heifer reproductive success? He has listed 4 choices. The polls are now open. You can be voting, and we're off and running. Compliance with the voluntary waiting period, or VWP. First service conception rate. Third service conception rate is your third choice, or age at first calving. So we've a little slower on the voting here. The clock is running on us at this point, and we're pretty close to 50% voters at this point, and we are excited to see the great voting record that's going on here. Boy, I shouldn't say too long. They're really slowing down on me here. We're going to give you about another 5 seconds before we close off here, and let's get our votes in here. Some of us are not voting here. Let's get on board. Let's get on board here, and we've got 2/3. Let's close it up and have Dr. Lee's interpretation.
All right, I'm glad to see that most of you answered compliance with the voluntary waiting period. First service conception is a big driver of heifer reproductive success, but if we don't get that first service into them at the proper time, early enough in our after the voluntary waiting period, we still wind up with poor reproductive success. So here's the question I have is how well do you control the variation in days to first service in your heifers? And we know that this is a significant driver for reproductive efficiency. It's actually fairly easy to look at this in DairyComp. Some of the other software programs also can do this. But if you look in Guide under the Replacement tab, so the only command you have to know in DairyComp is Guide, and you look under the Replacement heifer, under the Replacement tab, and you find reproduction and insemination activity and actual pattern of insemination, and find the question, does the actual age at first insemination match the stated voluntary waiting period? And for those of you who like the command line, this is the actual command behind that. But you don't even have to know the command. Just find the guide question and double-click that guide question, and it'll pop up with this report. And what you see here is the age at first insemination for heifer. So each of those squares represents the age at which that heifer was inseminated. That's on the y-axis. And it's the age of the first breeding, and then on the x-axis is the date that that insemination occurred. And so the most current data is on the right-hand side of the screen. The oldest data is on the left-hand side of the screen. So if we really want to know how we're currently doing, we look at the right-hand side of the screen. But here's something that's illustrated. This is a herd that moves heifers into the AI pen every week. And then beginning of August in this time period, they started giving prostaglandin to these heifers as they moved them into the AI pen. They were able to lower that age, that distribution or average age at first breeding by over 25 days. And they actually have a distribution of only 45 days to first insemination, to accomplish their first inseminations. And if you look at that, if it costs $3 for on average, 1.5 doses of prostaglandin per heifer, so 100% of them get it on the day you move them. About half of them are found in heat, and so half of them need a second dose 10 to 14 days later. This herd's saving about, at $3 a day, they're saving $36 in feed cost. Here's another herd that has poor control of first service. They have a schedule, and like clockwork, every 6 weeks they move these heifers into the AI pen, and they don't give prostaglandin. Their distribution, how long it takes them to get first service into their heifers, is 130 days. How many of you, if you had a 50-day voluntary waiting period in your cows, would find it acceptable to take an additional 130 days or out to 210 days in milk to get first service into your cows? That wouldn't be a profitable decision, would it? But yet we see a lot of herds that have very wide distributions for first service on their heifers. Now, I don't think the big opportunity for this herd is to give prostaglandin. If they did a 2-dose prostaglandin where they gave a dose at the day they moved the heifers into the AI pen, and they gave another dose 10 to 14 days later, they would lower the days to first service by about 12 days. That's not enough. The big opportunity for this herd is to get heifers into the AI pen more often. You can see that the AI technicians do a good job of getting semen into the heifers when they move them in there. They get them all bred, and then they have big gaps where they don't have any breedings. Do any of you ever have your AI technicians complain that they don't have any heifers to breed? Well, the reason they're complaining is you're not moving heifers into the AI pen often enough. So why is monitoring and controlling the distribution of first service so important? Well, let's look here. We have a herd here that has who does not have a plan for getting first service into their heifers. This is the, oh darn, we forgot to move heifers to the AI pen, and so they move their heifers into the AI pen very sporadically. What you find is that their first 3 services match up very nicely with what they do for first service, the pattern. Their pattern for the age at which their heifers become pregnant matches up with their plan for first service. And then their projected ages of freshening match up very nicely with what they do for first service. The message here for me is when you look across all of these first service, third service, age at conception, and projected age at calving, you find that the pattern is set by what you do with first service. That's why first service is so important, to make sure that we do a good job of getting semen into these heifers on a plan, on a weekly basis, according to a well-executed plan. This is the other thing, that when we look at the data from this herd, so the green, it represents their preg rates, and by their 21-day preg rates, and the red represents their insemination risk. When they actually move heifers into the AI pen, the AI technicians do quite well, and they're able to achieve over 30% pregnancy rates. But in those gaps in between, they don't do a very good job. And it's not the AI technician's fault, but it's management's fault. Here's another herd that does a very good job, and they move their heifers into the AI pen weekly. They use prostaglandin, and you see that this herd's achieving consistently over 30% preg rates and over 65% insemination rates. Very, very good performance out of this herd. So how do we minimize carrying costs per heifer through reproductive management? Well, the first thing is that animals should be bred on size, not age. Age does not determine when a heifer is ready to conceive, it's her size. Size determines when they start cycling. It also determines when they're ready to get inseminated. For those heifers that grow really well, there's no reason to delay them. Once they get to the proper size to breed, it's time to get them into the AI pen. First service is a critical step. And time matters. Time from birth and to how long it takes us to get them into the AI pen. Time from the AI pen move to first insemination, and time between subsequent inseminations if they're open. Synchronizing heifers is definitely an option. There are programs that do work in heifers. And open check heifers early and often, and then intervene to get them re-inseminated. There are really 2 components to improving pregnancy rates. One is, how do we manage first service? And the things that we need to do to optimally manage first service is we need to move these heifers into the AI pen every week. I do not see herds that achieve high pregnancy rates if they are not moving heifers into the AI pen at least every 2 weeks, and weekly is better. Use prostaglandin. 2 doses up front are going to save 12 to 14 days off of feed costs for heifers. The first dose on the date of AI pen move, and then the second dose 10 to 14 days later if they're not bred. Do a 28-day check on those heifers that are still not inseminated. Once they're in the AI pen 28 days, they get checked, and you get rid of the free martins and abnormal heifers, stop messing around with them, and then enroll those heifers that are not inseminated in an easy breed cedar sync timed AI protocol. And with that program, you're able to get first service into heifers within 36 days. Another option that some herds use is they time AI their heifers all on day 0. So on day 0 in the AI pen, 100% of the heifers are inseminated. Keys to improving pregnancy rates for second and greater service. So for those heifers that don't conceive, we can't forget about them. We got to keep working on them. Pregnancy check the AI pen every 7 days. You got to do it every 7 days if you're going to move heifers into the AI pen every weekly. You got to get the pregnant heifers out to make room for the new heifers. Re-enroll the open heifers in either with a prostaglandin or a 5-day cedar sync program. Move the pregnant heifers out and the open heifers in, and then reconfirm pregnancies early. And you either re-enroll or cull the problem heifers. I think in today's economic climate, it probably doesn't pay to re-enroll aborted heifers. And then you certainly don't want to ship open heifers back to the dairies. You get rid of them as soon as you know you're not going to keep them, you get rid of them. And then I think it's important that we also pay attention to management details. We got to pay attention to the health of these animals. We got to make sure that we manage our vaccination protocols properly in heifers, especially in pre-breeding period. We want to make sure that we've got efficiency of lockup, make sure that our headlocks work, that there's gates and fences behind the headlocks. You know, I feel sorry for AI technicians when they're out chasing a heifer around an open lot and they're trying to get a heifer to lock up. And invariably, it's the heifers that are in heat that are not locked up. And if you don't have fences behind the lockups to where the AI technicians can get the heifers in there and get them to lock up efficiently, they're just going to skip those heifers. We got to control mud. We got to make sure that we keep those corrals and concrete aprons clean, the concrete in front next to the headlocks. And we got to make sure that we've got proper nutrition and we manage our feed bunks. So so let's look at this herd that had this passive management, and we look at this wide distribution of age at conception. What's the impact of that for this herd? Well, this isn't a big herd, but when we look at this, the cost of on this spreadsheet, the cost of their Springer ration at that time, you can tell this is a little older data, was $2.67. They were targeting to get their heifers pregnant by 400 days, and when we calculated those additional days to conception, and which equated to additional days on feed, they were spending over $36,000 in additional feed cost for the heifers that were currently pregnant. Now, what did that equate to on a per head basis? It actually was over $200 of additional feed for these heifers. This was a day that a Dutchman cried. He saw that he was spending $200 in additional feed cost because they were not doing a good job of managing their per heifer, because they were not doing a good job of managing reproduction in their heifers. Now, let's look at this herd that's got active management, and we see that they were only spending, this was much larger. They had about $41,000 of additional feed cost, but equated to only a little over $4 per head. They were doing such a fantastic job of getting their heifers to conceive up front that they had very few extra days on feed for their heifers. So I'm going to give you some summary thoughts here. Excess days on feed cost big money. You stop the clock on excess feed costs by getting heifers pregnant. And a very simple program to accomplish this is to move heifers into the AI pen weekly, administer prostaglandin on entry into the AI pen. You don't even need a list to manage this program. You just tail chalk all their heads, you tail chalk all the heifers blue. And then as the heifers are inseminated, you change that tail chalk color to orange. And then 10 to 14 days later, you go back into the pen, and any heifer that still has a blue tail chalk, you give her another dose of prostaglandin. This is exactly the program that actively managed herd was doing. And they were able to accomplish first insemination in all heifers in a very efficient manner, and were able to drive earlier conception. There's really just 5 simple steps to better heifer reproduction. Step 1 is get the heifers into the AI pen every week. Step 2 is to ensure heifers are bred shortly after entering the AI pen. And then make sure all the heifers get inseminated within a short time after moving into the AI pen. And routinely pregnancy check and reconfirm these heifers. And then run monitor reports after every pregnancy check. You want to look at voluntary waiting period compliance, distribution at first breeding, pregnancy rate, insemination risk, conception risk. The question you should be asking is, what is our current performance, and is there anything we can do to improve, that needs to be done to improve reproductive performance? And then if you don't get to that last question, what do we need to do, and then act on the answers to that question, you're not going to improve production. And I'll leave that and open it up to any questions.
Okay, well, very good, Dr. John Lee. Excellent job. We have lots of good questions here to ask you here. Let's put that next PowerPoint up if you can, Dr. Lee, if you put that up. Our next Horse Dairyman webinar will be December 10th. It'll look at consistent, efficient TMR feeding with Dr. Tom Oberg from D.V.M, and that's sponsored by Kuhn North America as far as that goes. Do you have one more slide to click up there by any chance, Dr. Lee, or not? Okay, let's make sure we see our sponsors. Again, we certainly want to thank Pfizer for their willingness to sponsor this program here today. We thank you very much for your sponsorship here. And Dr. Lee, excellent. We appreciate your excellent presentation. Let's back up one more PowerPoint. We'll leave that other one up promoting the Hordes Dairyman website if we can. And here comes your questions at this point. First of all, I want to thank you, Dr. Lee, very much for using that orange and blue marker on the heads of those heifers, because that's Fighting Illini orange, or I guess also Florida or whatever state you wish. But we picked up on that one pretty quickly. Anyway, off and running here. Here's a couple of questions we have. First of all, do you agree to start inseminating heifers at 55% of body weight of mature cows, irregardless of age, even if heifers are bred at, say, 10 or 11 months of age?
For those heifers that performed really well, it's based on size. When for a Holstein heifer, when you get her to 51 inches and she's sitting there at 55-60% of her body weight, I think you can go ahead and breed them. As long as you keep feeding them, they're going to continue to grow, and they're going to calve in at the size you want them. Now you have to look at that really as a percentage of mature body weight. And if you've got a herd that has really big animals, genetically they're really big animals, then they're going to be a little bigger animal than your neighbor down the street who has smaller animals.
Okay, here's a kind of a related question at this point. Let's go ahead and click on the sponsorship slide one more time, Dr. Lee, if you would, please. We certainly want to give sponsors a good opportunity to see who's bringing this program to you. Here's another question: how many heat cycles should a heifer have before inseminating at the proper weight, say 800 pounds, as you mentioned earlier? Some people are saying that inseminating in the first heat, even with proper weight, is rarely successful. Doc, comments?
Yeah, actually, you don't do it off the first heat. The question I have is, or the comment I have is that most people don't know when these first heats occur. Most of these heifers will start cycling at around 55% of their mature body weight. It's really body weight that determines age of puberty. And so the thing is to get these heifers to grow them, nutritionally grow them, get them to size. If you've got them at the proper body weight, proper size and body weight, they're going to start cycling. There are very few, it's just a few exceptions that are are not going to cycle.
Okay. Another question. Isn't breeding by size counterintuitive to compliance with the voluntary waiting period? Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, so voluntary waiting period is for most herds or for most computer programs or management programs is based on age. So yeah, of course, if you are breeding them, so let's say your voluntary waiting period is 13 months, but you have some heifers that are going to go, that are big enough at 12 months, and you get them to the AI pen, they're getting inseminated earlier. So it's counterintuitive to that. There is another way to calculate pregnancy rate, and that is based on AI pen move date. And so in DairyComp, you can actually calculate it both ways, either based on age in days or AI pen move date. And so you can capture those heifers if you calculate it based on AI pen move date. AI pen move date calculation really is an assessment of cyclicity of the heifers of the AI pen and how good of a job the AI technicians are doing. If you calculate it based on age voluntary waiting period, that's really more of an assessment of management and how good of a job are you doing at getting heifers into the AI pen.
Okay, another listener noticed that the heifer preg rate was lower after each cycle, like 40 to 35 to 30. Is that a biological factor, or why do those conception rates drop off?
So that was just a hypothetical. They actually don't drop off. They're actually fairly steady through about 4 cycles. I just did that to be very conservative in my numbers, so that people could see that you know, for illustrative purposes. But they actually do not drop off. Just like in cows, they remain fairly static for about for the first cycles.
Okay. Another quick question, not a quick question actually. Did you forget to mention the economic impact of lost milk due to an older heifer at first calving? The extra feed cost is obvious, but most people forget about 30 to 60 days less milk that they'd be missing out on. Comments on that?
Well, so that is true. I measured. I did that up front on one of my first slides. But I tried to really, for illustrative purposes, I really tried to bring this down to a very simple measurement. What's the cost of a day open? And the cost of a day open is at least the cost of the amount that it cost you to feed a close-up heifer, because that's where these heifers are going to spend those extra days. But there are definitely additional costs. There are the costs associated with lost milk. There's cost associated with delayed income. There's also cost associated with if you do a poor job with heifer reproduction and heifers are calving older, you have to maintain a larger inventory of heifers. Those heifers represent a larger cost of producing 100 weight of milk. They also you also have to dedicate more facilities to heifer raising. So there are, you know, the inventory costs become a significant cost also.
Okay, another quick question. Do you have a magic time that you decide you should pull the plug on breeding heifers? Is there a certain number of breedings, certain number of days or age? Do you have a guideline on that?
You know, I don't, honestly, I really don't do that. I have I do in a way. I have the maximum age at which we would want heifers to calve. So then that translates back to the maximum age at which we will breed them. What I also find is that if producers will concentrate on getting first service into their heifers and monitoring their heifers based on pregnancy rate, we wind up with so many more heifers becoming pregnant up front, right at the start of shortly after the voluntary waiting period, that our cutoff, there's so few animals that ever reach that cutoff that it becomes less and less of a management focus. Yeah, I think what you do is you just set an age, a maximum age at which you want them to calve, and cut them off there.
And you mentioned you have one. Do you want to share that with our listeners?
It depends on the breed. It depends on whether we're talking Jerseys or Holsteins. For Holsteins, honestly, when I start looking at heifers that calve over 28 months of age, I just see really poor performance out of them. So for me, it's 27, 28 months maximum.
Well, very good, John. Dr. John Lee, excellent seminar and great response to our questions here. Jim, this will be archived and stored on the website here in the next couple of days. So if some of you want to go back and listen to parts of this or all of it again, it will be there, or recommend to your neighbors that may have missed this. We'd be happy to have them come to our archives. Go to the Hordes Dairyman website. We want to thank Dr. John Lee for his dedication and effort in pulling this webinar together for us here. And with that, we'll stand adjourned. We wish everybody a happy Thanksgiving, and we'll see everybody hopefully on December 10th when Tom Orberg will join us on TMR Audits. Have a good Thanksgiving.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great Thanksgiving.